There's a person in almost every social group who feels exhausted without understanding why. Not because they hate people, but because part of their mind never fully stops scanning the room. They notice the smile that arrives half a second too late, the tension underneath ordinary conversations, the emotional shifts nobody else reacts to. Most people call this intuition. But often, this kind of hyper-awareness was never a gift. It was adaptation. Some nervous systems learn very early that paying attention to emotional changes keeps you safe, so they become experts at reading people. And after years of doing it automatically, they no longer know how to relax around others. They don't enter rooms normally anymore. Part of their mind enters like a surveillance system, quietly tracking everything. And if you've ever felt mentally exhausted just from being around people for too long, this video may explain why. Let's take the spiritual angle off the table and look at what's actually happening inside this kind of brain. Neuroscientists call it thin slicing, rapid, unconscious pattern recognition, combined with something called incongruence detection. Most people listen to conversations through words. Highly perceptive people listen through inconsistencies. They notice when someone's tone doesn't match their expression, when enthusiasm feels slightly rehearsed, when kindness feels performative instead of natural. The brain processes these tiny signals automatically, not consciously, almost like a survival reflex. When a coworker says, "I'm really happy you got promoted," most people hear support, but a hyper-aware brain instantly notices the delayed smile, the tightness around the eyes, the tiny flicker of resentment underneath the sentence. And once the brain becomes trained to detect emotional danger like this, it becomes very difficult to stop. Because eventually the mind stops asking, "What are people saying?" and starts asking, "What are people hiding?" That's where the traps begin. Trap 1. Becoming the uncomfortable person in the room. People say they want honesty, but most social groups survive on unspoken agreements. Everyone quietly agrees not to notice certain things. The fake laugh, the passive-aggressive comment, the friend who says, "I'm happy for you," while subtly competing with you underneath. Most people notice parts of it. They just let it pass. You don't. And over time, that changes the way people react to you. You meet someone new, they're charming, confident, magnetic. Everyone instantly likes them, but your brain catches something else. The smile feels rehearsed. The enthusiasm feels too fast. Every sentence sounds slightly optimized for approval. And while everyone else relaxes into the performance, your nervous system quietly steps backward. So eventually you say something small. "This person feels a little fake." And suddenly the atmosphere changes. You overthink too much. You're too negative. Why do you always assume the worst? Because the moment you point at something uncomfortable, people stop feeling emotionally safe around you. Not necessarily because you're wrong, but because awareness changes the emotional contract of the room. The person who notices too much becomes dangerous. So highly perceptive people slowly learn to stay quiet. They smile, they nod, they pretend not to notice what they notice. But forcing yourself to ignore reality creates a very specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of seeing something clearly and realizing nobody wants it spoken out loud. Trap 2. The detective trap. When you stop trusting what people say, you begin trusting only your own analysis, and slowly observation turns into hypervigilance. A delayed text suddenly feels loaded with meaning. A tired glance feels like rejection. A compliment feels suspicious instead of comforting. Nothing feels simple anymore. Because once the brain becomes trained to detect hidden danger, it starts searching for danger everywhere. Psychology calls this confirmation bias. The brain filters reality in ways that confirm its own fears. You notice one cold interaction and unconsciously ignore 10 warm ones. You prepare emotionally for betrayal before betrayal even exists. And the exhausting part is, this strategy often works. You become very difficult to manipulate, very difficult to fool, but you also lose something important: rest. You're like someone with extremely sensitive hearing. You can hear cracks in a building long before it collapses. It protects you. But eventually, every sound starts feeling like a threat. and little by little, survival replaces peace. You stop experiencing relationships directly. You experience them through analysis. Trap 3. Becoming an emotional dumping ground. Because you understand people so easily, you often understand what they feel before they say a single word. You become the listener, the emotionally stable one, the person everyone vents to. People feel understood around you, but almost nobody asks what you feel. They assume you're too self-aware to need comfort, too strong to need reassurance, too emotionally intelligent to fall apart, so eventually you become something strange. A glass wall. You see through everyone, but when people look at you, they mostly see their own reflection. And that creates a very quiet form of exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly understanding people who never truly try to understand you back. So how do you survive a mind that notices too much? The goal is not becoming less aware. The goal is learning how to carry awareness without letting it consume your entire life. Principle 1. Strategic ignorance. Not every truth requires a reaction. You notice the manipulation, the fake enthusiasm, the performance. Fine. Awareness is information, not assignment. You do not need to expose every inconsistency you see. Some things are healthier observed quietly and left alone, because peace is not found by controlling every room. It's found by realizing you no longer need to. Principle 2. Understand the mask. Most people are not pretending because they're evil. They're pretending because they're afraid. The loud bragger is often deeply insecure. The emotionally cold person is usually terrified of being hurt again. Once you start seeing the wound underneath the behavior, disgust slowly turns into compassion, and life becomes softer. Principle 3. Stop trying to control the future. Highly perceptive people often believe that if they analyze enough, they can avoid pain completely. But that's impossible. Sometimes your intuition will be right. Sometimes people will disappoint you. But constantly preparing for betrayal means you never fully experience connection while it's here. If your intuition says there's a 20% chance something ends badly, learn to tolerate the uncertainty and still enjoy the 80% that exists right now, because living fully always involves emotional risk. You can see the thorns on a rose, but if you spend your whole life measuring how sharp they are, you'll never smell the flower. The strangest part is, most highly perceptive people spend years believing their exhaustion is a personality flaw, that they're too sensitive, too intense, too aware to function normally around others. But many of them were never weak. Their nervous system simply learned too early that missing the wrong emotional signal could hurt them. So they adapted. They became emotional pattern recognition systems, human lie detectors, experts at reading tension before it fully appeared, not because they wanted power, but because somewhere in their past, awareness felt safer than surprise. And eventually, survival became perception. That's why people like this often feel lonely in ordinary conversations. Because once you've spent years listening beneath people's words, it's very hard to return to the surface. But maybe healing was never about becoming less aware. Maybe healing is realizing you no longer have to carry the emotional weight of every room you enter. You're allowed to rest now. Most people spend their whole lives trying to become less sensitive. Maybe the real goal is learning how to feel safe while staying aware. So which trap do you relate to the most? The uncomfortable truth teller, the detective, or the glass wall? Tell me in the comments. And if this video made you feel understood in a way you couldn't explain before, subscribe. This channel is for people who've spent their whole lives noticing too much. See you next time.